Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Tech Show. I'm your host, Joel Sante, and in today's episode, we have quite a bit of stuff to talk about. Quite a lot, I would say. Uh, but welcome back. We're really excited to walk through today's episode, specifically three-tier web apps and the logic tier. We followed up on this specific tier based off the conversation we had last week on the presentation layer. I know during our conversation there was a lot of stuff to talk about 3 tier, but it's just too much. There's so much to talk about, and we cannot necessarily cover it all in one episode. So in today's episode, we're going to cover the middle layer or the middle tier, or people like to call it the logic tier. Uh, we have a couple of architectures that we will walk through, but also we are going to make this conversational where if you have any questions about our discussion, feel free to always leave that in the chat, add that to the comments. We would answer any of those questions as we navigate through the various topics that we have for today. But let's just recap for a second here. So last week, we covered the presentation layer, right? The presentation layer, as we had discussed, is responsible for delivering the user interface or handling the user interaction of an application. So this would typically consist of your web servers that user actually access, or CDNs, or static content that you sort of serve to your customers. And the services that we had covered here were like Amazon EC2 for running your web service, or your if you really want to use other stuff like containers, that, but we didn't really cover that. We really wanted to focus on the very basics, which are EC2s. We also covered like CDNs like CloudFront. We spoke a little bit about ABLs, or just load balancers in general. And I think we spent a lot of time talking about the scalability of that application. So discussing how we utilize auto scaling groups. I think that resonated with a lot of people in our post uh, podcast conversations we've had with people when it comes to, hey, we need to hear more about auto scaling groups and how people implement scalability or just scaling in general in their application. So we're going to set some episodes for just scaling in general and reliability and availability. So we're going to cover that in a separate conversation. Uh, Today's conversation, we want to focus more on the logic tier or the application tier. And it's something that we're going to spend more of our time today discussing. And in subsequent meetings, we're going to discuss uh, how this would look in a demo scenario. Then we move forward to like the database layer or the data tier. With that being said, I'm going to pass it on to Dunieski to sort of give us an overview of what a logic tier would look like, and or an application tier, people like to call it, and what that encompasses. So, Dunieski, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joel. And great to be here today and be able to talk about the presentation or the middle tier, a logic tier, which is so important in a three-tier web app, right? So I'm gonna ask my friend Iso to share the screen if you can, Iso. And let's just show here a very important architecture that we showed last week. Is a little changed from last week, but still it shows the content that we want to display and want to talk about this today, right? Now we discussed the front end, the web tier last week, and this one. Want to say that the middle tier in a three-tier web app is it's very important. It's often referred to the application logic tier, right? And it plays a crucial role in processing the business logic and the data transformation between the presentation tier, the front end, and the data tier, which is the database, right? Now, in terms of the architecture, we have the presentation tier, we have the middle tier, and we have the data tier, which is for another session, right? Now, what are the functions of the middle tier? Well, it processes the business logic. So it's the one that handles the core logic of the application, right? This includes the processing, the user inputs, applying business rules, making decisions based on inputs, right? Now it also adds a kind of a go between the web tier and the data tier, right? And it make the calls to the database, fetches the data, and makes the decision based on the inputs, right? Now, it also transforms the data into usable format for the front end. Now, it could convert the raw data from the database into a more consumable one, because sometimes the raw data is not easy to understand, right? So we have to do some ETL on it. And it also might involve aggregating the data and maybe formatting responses or applying filters, just in case you want to make sure that you only get the data that you need, right? Now, it will return to the front end with a status code. It's usually known as HTML status code. If you see a 200 or in the range of 200s, that's good news. That something is right, right? But if you start seeing like a 400 or 500, something is wrong, right? And 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 if you're a developer, you understand what I'm talking about. If you're not a developer, you can go to Google and Google HTML status codes, and it will tell you all the different numbers and what they mean, right? Now, the middle tier also validates the data. It gets the data that it gets from the front end to ensure it meets the required criteria before processing it and storing it in the database, right? Remember, we have to be careful with SQL injection attacks, right? You don't want to have that. That's why sometimes we have to apply web application firewall to be able to intercept that and not let that pass through. Otherwise, you're gonna get some problems in the long run, right? Now, the middle tier also integrates with external APIs, right? And this is very important because you can make API call to third-party services. Like I always, when I talk about APIs, I always talk about the database, the the movie database, which is the one that gives you the synopsis and the author, the actors and the different directors of the movie, and that is an API, right? That you can make calls to, and then they get the information from about the movies and display it in your website, right?
That's
Now,
that's a great example.
yeah,
Sorry,
yeah,
sorry to interject. That's a
yeah,
great
no, no,
example.
no,
I think that point in terms of like having the ability to access or use APIs, and if this is the first time someone is utilizing APIs, building the logic tier would be the tier that would help them understand how
hmm
API utilization would work between the presentation layer and the database layer. Because you are utilizing this tier to essentially facilitate the communication between that web tier and the database. And this could be, like you said, API calls, or if they really want to get complicated or add the additional capabilities, they can start looking to message brokers like message queues or just messaging in general like XQS and possibly data streams in general. So I think I just want to add that point of if APIs are being utilized in the logic tier, which absolutely is going to be for anyone that's looking to build 3 tier web apps and you get to the portion of logic tier, you're going to be absolutely learning a ton about APIs if you haven't utilized it
right.
a lot or utilizing it at all. So I just wanted to throw that out there for folks that are very excited about building
hmm
3 tier web apps and say, hey, well, does it cover everything? It does.
right. And some of the technologies that we can use there, they're various, right? We can use GraphQL if you want to fetch the data using like key pairs, right? Or you can use Node.js if you install Node.js, install it in your application server or install Express. Express is it's it's kind of a people don't use it that much as they used to before, but they still create servers using Express and together with Node.js, but very popular ways to use GraphQL. GraphQL it has a learning curve, right? Or you
Yep.
can use APIs like API Gateway in the middle, so you can make API calls using routes, right? And HTML methods like get, put, delete, post, right? Update and things like that, right? And Django and Ruby on Rails, it's very important too. You can use a RESTful API. You can use an HTTP API as well. You can use a WebSocket API. So multiple ways that you can use for this implementation, and also caching. Caching is very important, right? So you can have a caching mechanism, so you don't have to go to the database so frequently, right? And some people use some sort of elastic cache there. They use Redis or they use other type of elastic cache, so they can go ahead and get that data from that layer, the caching layer, instead of doing or making so many trips to the database.
Yes,
That's one of these.
I've
And
also seen. Oh, go ahead. I
yeah.
was gonna say I've also seen like with the talk of API gateways, right? And being
Hmm.
able to make these API calls to, in this case, the logic tier. I've also seen that people are implementing caching in the APIs themselves. So like the service API gateway, implementing some sort of like caching capabilities to not necessarily all the time go to the database layer to grab information. Uh, would you say that fits into a three-tier web app? Because I've only a lot of times seen it for serverless application, serverless architectures, but not necessarily for three-tier web apps. For the audience that are building three-tier web apps, would you say that's an easy integration to implement sort of like API gateways or like those functionalities in this?
In a 3D web app, are you asking me about before that space between the middle tier and the database?
Yes.
Okay. There's some ways to do it. You can use Elastic Cache, like I just mentioned before, right?
Gotcha.
And have some sort of layer before the database. It could be a NoSQL database. It could be a SQL database. You can use an Amazon SQS or a queue, right? Kind of well, queue is it's more like for kind of not overwhelming the API and all that. But Elasticache is one of the Redis is very popular, memcached. But Redis is more powerful, so a lot of customers use Redis to cache the data. Some people use Solar. Solar is a very popular caching mechanism as well, right? But and the good thing about Solar is that it's open source and it's free. You don't have to pay for it, so people like free stuff. Um,
Who
so
doesn't?
who doesn't, right? And Redis is kind of a paid service, right? But that's pretty typical to put kind of have that, and also another way to kind of soften the load, offload a little bit of the database is to use kind of a replica in the database, right? That kind of improves the performance of the database as well. So you don't have to read from the master database. You can read from the replicas as well, right? And that's gonna kind of mm, soften the load, or kind of make the load lighter for the database.
I think
Um,
I
yeah.
think Dineski and Joel, that's interesting that you guys brought up API gateway. I
Hmm.
think like using API gateway is more like if you want to manage your APIs, right? Like you mentioned Dineski, like RESTful services, right? You want to create those get methods, those post methods, and all that. So if you integrate or implement some sort of a managed service like API gateway, for example, on AWS, that can offload actually handling a particular server, right? Or even your application instance in this case. So that's something you can put that in mind, especially when you're trying to create like microservices or implementing something that's on a broader scale.
Hmm.
Something like that would be very, very helpful. And it's kind of
Yeah.
speed ups the development. And you don't have to manage those
Hmm.
servers or instances.
So in a nutshell, I would say that the application tier basically receives the login request via the API endpoint. So who doesn't remember when you log in a website, right? Who doesn't know about that? Everybody knows about that, right? So the middle tier is the one processing that login action, right? Is getting those credentials, the username and password, whatever you're using, right? If you're using federated login using Google or any identity provider like Yahoo, whatever Amazon, whatever you're using, that middle tier is processing that, right? And is if it is your vanilla authentication, like username and password, is gonna compare that against the database, right? And then it's gonna return like, okay, you can log in, you can access this because it matches what you're entering in the input box matches what I have in the database, right? Now, also it validates the credentials format. It does that. It queries the data tier to verify the credentials. It applies the business logic. You check if the account is logged or not logged. So it can do all that. It also creates the user session because you want to keep the user logged in across the website, right? When you switch from one page to another, that user must remain logged in, and he has a cookie that doesn't expire, right? And it returns a response to the presentation layer, right, indicating success or failure. So that's basically what the middle tier does. It is the core of processing the whole application, right? And it is the go between, I would say, the link between the web tier and the database tier, right? It's
So
just
would you
yeah,
say it's a middleman?
yeah,
Right? It's a
middleman. It's like
middleman between the
mm,
server in the back room that is in the
right,
club, right?
right,
Serving the
right,
people there, and
right,
the security guard.
right, right,
Yeah.
Right? It's like
Yeah.
it's the thing that's in the middle between you actually getting into the actual club or getting into a conference, whatever you want to utilize
hmm
as a reference. It's that person that sort of brokers between what's in front of them and what's
hmm
in the back of them, right?
And that's a good analogy, Joel,
yeah,
because it is really is a man in the middle. It's like it's an engine, right? And it's kind of hidden from the public. So you
Yep,
don't really want that to be exposed, right? That's why it's
absolutely.
usually placed in a private subnet.
yeah.
So you retrieve
It's
the data from the presentation layer, which is your web server, and then that data will then be processed by the application instance with whatever
mhm,
framework is being used. And then if it needs to perform like a CRUD operation, like a create, update, delete operation, it will
Yep,
use a database
yeah,
in that in
right,
that
right,
at the back end, right? And it will
yeah,
treat that data, process it again, and then spits it out back to the presentation layer.
yeah. So folks in the audience, don't get us wrong. Don't get us wrong. Every tier is important, right? Every tier is
yep,
important, but the middle tier is the backbone of the application. It is the one that handles the critical business logic. It does the data processing. It integrates the tasks across the application, and it enables the application to function properly and securely. Without the middle tier, things are not the same. You can still have a web tier accessing the database, but that's not recommended. That's not recommended because the web tier has open port 80.443 and it's open to every single IP in the world. And you're letting that middle tier, that web tier, access your database. That's not good. That's not good. There should be some security implemented in between, and that's the function of the middle tier. Is the middleware, is the middleman in between. So it's very important to have a robust middle tier with security groups with security. So that communication between the front end and the database can flow smoothly and securely. So that's very important. Uh, Something very important that I wanted to say. Right.
I think I would switch up my analogy after Danieski mentioned this, right? Would
Mm-hmm.
you say it's more so of the middle tier, the logic tier, being the bodyguard in front of a business,
Yeah,
or
yeah. I would say the database is the asset.
the asset you want to
Yeah,
retrieve? It's like
yeah,
the drink at the bar where it's like,
It's
hey,
like
yeah.
the
I,
gold mine,
I'm at
right?
this bar, I'm at this bar to go grab a drink, and I need to get through security to make sure that I'm good. And if
hmm
the security scans me and says, hey, you have the right to access the database or the drink, now go through. Or
Right, right,
you're 18 years old or more, so
right,
you get to go
right.
through.
Maybe
Right.
even
So
Joel, if you put
Yeah,
it like this, like you can think of data. Data is like it's like gold, right? It's
yeah,
something that you want to secure. You don't want any anyone from the outside world to get access. Only authorized
Right.
people.
Right.
So you put in a layer on top of that database, right, to manage the data that's coming in and coming out. So
Yeah.
that's
Yep.
that's
Sure.
that's and that's very
Sure.
important, right? And then
Sure.
you slowly use that data, and you retrieve the data that is only needed by a particular user. To
Right.
You don't
But
Yeah.
want
also, you're
everything to
not
be
only
exposed.
just serving the data. I want to make this point too to the audience. You're not only serving the data to the customer in the presentation tier. There's actual business logic, or there's like uh, things that are happening in that application itself. So let's say if it's not necessarily data that you're looking to retrieve, and you're just looking to get some processes done in
Hmm.
the business logic, that could be done too as well and served back to the customer, right?
Right.
It's not necessarily, hey, I just need to grab data and bring it back to
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
customer.
Yeah.
The business behind that application instance or the application tier is also important to be able to serve back to the customer. And that logic should make sense to make sure that whoever needs to access that data, or who needs to access that, whether it's calculations, business tier that needs to process data, whatever it is,
Yeah. I would.
serving through
Yeah.
the application tier. Go ahead,
I would.
Denise.
I would say the database is a very important person that you have to
Yep,
protect. Right. A very
yep,
important person that contains very important information. Right. And then you have the bodyguard who has to be protected too, because if you're not protected, how can you protect someone else? Right. That's why we
yep,
put the presentation, the logic tier. We put it in a private subnet. Right. And
yep,
private subnet with no public IP. It has to be protected. And then we have the audience, we have the public in the web tier that is not protected because it doesn't need protection. Doesn't need it, right?
you're outside
Exactly.
the
Yeah,
bar. You're
that's
outside the
right, right.
bar.
You're
You don't
outside
Exactly.
the
need protection.
outside the perimeter,
Yeah,
right? And then you have the public trying to reach out uh, for the important person, and then you have the bodyguard stopping people, preventing people from accessing that. Is that you have to go
yep,
through me? What are you
And
gonna do?
and and Danielski, you also
Yeah,
have
right.
to like protect that bodyguard too as well, right? Because you don't
Yeah, it
want
has to be
someone
protected.
to
Yeah,
actually come in and attack that bodyguard and bring down
that's
the whole system, right? And
that's
then
why
people can flood in, flood out,
yeah, the bodyguard has to wear a vest,
a
right?
vest,
A
yes, yeah,
vest has to use a gun, right? Has to be armed. So
yeah,
things like that, right? So
something to
in
protect himself.
in
Yeah,
the screen we see the middle tier, the application tier in the middle, right? The application instances in the middle, and then we see how the interaction happens between the web instance and the RDS database, right? So this is the guy that is. It's like I would say it's like in basketball is the guy that someone passes the ball to him and then he passes the ball to someone else to dunk it, right? So similar to that, Joel, you like basketball, you know what I'm talking about, right? So
I was
the
waiting on
center
you to
guard, the
try
center
to
guard, or
make.
who?
I was trying to see if Denise can make that analogy of like how it fits in basketball, but I think you're so close. You're like the guy that it's an alley oop, man. It's an alley oop. You pass the ball
yeah,
to the point guard that alley oops to the power forward or the center. So
but that person that
that's
receives the ball and passes it to someone else has to be a strong person, right? It has to be
yeah,
someone
Yeah,
tall, strong, and ready to be hit
right.
and keep and stay
And
standing.
that person in the
Yeah,
middle also has to route things, right? Like you can't just give them something to do something and just stays there. Doesn't
yeah,
know how to do
yeah,
anything. They have to route it. Route. Okay, this means
right,
I have to give this ball to someone that might, go in and actually make the score.
right,
So it has to
right,
be very intelligent.
right. Very
Yeah.
important top, very important point. As well, uh, routing happens in the application tier. It happens there. The routing, right? Let's say that you have multiple tables. You have users, consumers, users. You have products. You have orders, right? How does the database know what data to give, right? What it does is that it knows it through the routes, right? So you have to make an API call to the database specifying the route, right? The access, what do you want from these database users? I want the first name and last name of the user for this particular data, the table, products. I need this product, and for this table orders, I need the holders order details from this particular user. And then when you have joins and all that, and that you can bring the tables together, right? And that's
Yeah.
when you use SQL statements, right? That's why I like so much. I like GraphQL. I like it so much for the API calls because you can have a schema, right? With GraphQL and be able to bring exactly what you want from the database, right? But there's always has to be authentication all over, right? Authentication is very important, and permissions is very important because the database has some security, some firewalls, right? That you have to have permissions to access the data, right? And this is what we do with the application instances, right? We have a data firewall in the databases, right? And what do we do? We have we open a particular firewall to only the private instances in the middle, right? And only those private instances can access the database, right? And the same
Yeah.
we do with the web tier.
You know,
So it's
it's
very important.
interesting that you mentioned GraphQL and SQL, because usually, like, when it comes to data accessing, the first thing that comes in mind is you actually you use SQL, right, to query the data. But sometimes when you have, like, let's say in an application instance, you have some sort of like framework running, a JavaScript framework, some like Spring or .NET Core or whatever type of framework. You usually need some sort of mapper, right? You need, like, something called an object relational mapping, or a mapper that kind of maps between your code and the data that you're retrieving, the SQL data that you're retrieving. So there's a lot of frameworks that does this. I know for in .NET, back in the day, I used something called the Entity Framework that does this kind of relationship between the
Hmm.
objects of your code and maps it to the tables or the columns within your database.
Yeah,
Um, and there's many of those types of, like, sort of services that do that, like that mapping.
yeah. It's very important to know what type of database you're using, right? If you're using a uh, no, and
Like a
NoSQL
Postgres,
databases.
yeah, or NoSQL, like relational non. Yep,
Yeah, if you're using any type of databases like SQL database or NoSQL database, it's very important to know what type of statements are you using. You're using, right? Because even though PostgreSQL, MySQL, SQL Server, all that they use SQL, the syntax varies, right? So you have to be familiar with the type of database you're fetching the data from, right? Now,
yeah,
if you're using NoSQL database, that's a different ballgame. You have to know other technologies like GraphQL, for example, or maybe how to fetch the data from MongoDB, right?
right.
A document
And
database and
that's
things
where
like that.
that ORM comes into play, like that object relational mapping. It kind of abstracts that away from you, so you don't have to, if you don't
Right.
want to use pure SQL, or because there's every database has their own SQL type. SQL Server probably has T-SQL, Oracle
Hmm.
has their own SQL type of version of SQL.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you wanna use some sort of
Yeah.
mapper, like, in the
Right.
middle.
Yeah. Oracle has this learning curve too. It's a little different from SQL. A little different, even though it's a SQL statement, a SQL database. It has some particularities in terms of the syntax and the way it works, right? I remember
Yeah,
when I did my master's degree in computer science, I remember taking an Oracle class, and I suffered during the entire class because it was kind of different. My mindset was was only focused on SQL statements and the ones that I knew before, the more popular ones. I'm not saying that Oracle is not popular; it's just that it's different, right? And
yeah.
it's not widely used or taught in universities, right?
Yeah, you
You
used
should
it
be
in
aware.
enterprise back in the day. Yeah. Even for me, like, I
Hmm.
used SQL Server, like when I used to work at a previous company. So it
Hmm.
was just SQL Server. So there is a learning curve that you have. Not only do you have to learn SQL, but you have to learn T-SQL, which is like the syntax of, like, it's a SQL Server. So it's an additional
Hmm.
SQL that you have to learn, and that's used for creating, like, stored procedures and all this stuff. And it kind of gets
Right,
pretty difficult if you're, let's
right,
say, switching from SQL Server
right,
to, let's say, Oracle or Postgres or
right,
MySQL,
right,
because
right.
you're going to have to learn that a little bit.
So that's a little bit about databases. Let's just go back to the application tier,
Yeah.
which is the one that um, we're focusing now. So in a few words, the application tier is, I would say, the core of the three-tier web app is the
Yeah.
core. Without it, like I said before, you still have an application, but it's not as secure and robust as it should be, right?
And that
It
would
should,
be if you would you say that would be like a two-tier web app?
yeah, two tier. Some people have a four tier, like they have like maybe an extra layer there of another server, right? And we're just talking about one single thread, like one availability zone. ISO, I don't remember well when you show the screen, but do you have two availability zones there? Two, right?
Yeah, we
Okay,
have
we have
to.
you have two. So this is we talked about scalability last time, but this is very important also in the application tier, right? We
So
have to make this tier scalable as well. Yep.
this is where I want to get a team consensus here, and I think the viewers would like to see how this logic tier fits in the overall picture, right? I know we've talked about presentation layer last week. We're talking about the logic tier this week, and we talked about how the presentation layer fits in the whole three-tier web app overall picture.
Hmm.
Correct me if I'm wrong. To me, when I think of a three-tier web app, and I think specifically on the logic tier, I usually think about four ways it fits in the overall picture. The intermediary role, which is essentially being able to act as a conduit between the presentation layer and the data tier.
Mhm.
Then it essentially processing the inputs that it gets from the presentation tier, and then it applies any business logic that needs to be done on it. Then it probably interacts with the data tier to fetch or store data. But also the other role that I see it fits in the overall picture is the being able to handle the core application functionalities, whether it's like I think as Danieski had mentioned this, where it's like data processing, calculations, making that business making processes. That's something that it does. Then additionally, I think Danieski, you brought this up too again, is the scalability and the security of this too as well. Actually, I'll decouple that, right? So the scalability of this, where you want to have the logic tier isolated, right? You don't want to have this. Typically, you would see this in the two-tier web app where it's not isolated. With the two-tier web app, the logic itself is isolated. And the reason why is to one, security reasons, where it's in that you saw it in the architecture, it's in a private subnets. And this would help you enhance the security of the application, restricting that direct access from the internet and only giving access to certain resources that you depict need access to. And it all comes back to also finally the scalability of this. You can also scale easily with the logic tier as well. So I think, would you guys agree to the point of how it fits in the overall picture? There's probably more to than I'm speaking to right now, but with those four that I've mentioned, do you guys agree to how it fits in the overall picture with processing business logic, enhancing the performance of uh, enhancing the performance in general, but also the scalability of that, the security and the isolation of the business logic and business tier within that application, but also the role that it plays between being that middleman between that presentation layer and the database layer. It's sending data back and forth. It's giving the user the ability to interact uh, between the logic of the application core and also the database itself.
Yeah. Sure. And it creates the sessions too. The sessions,
Exactly.
user sessions. Sessions are very important, right? Because you can track the user across the application, right?
Maybe
You
we
don't
can
have
give
to.
them, guys, if you guys don't mind, maybe we can give like a small example. Let's talk about, let's say the example Danieski mentioned earlier about a typical user login. Okay, you have
Mm,
your web page, right? And that's basically HTML. So the moment you write, you retrieve that HTML page, that usually gets sent to the web tier, right? And then you retrieve that the HTML page. So then when you type in your user login and password, when you click submit, or log in, then what happens here is that it goes through the application tier, right? And the application tier will do the processing for you. So in that case, there would be probably some sort of API route that would call a security function or something like that, which will check if that the username, the password is in the database, right? If it will do some sort of like processing and then output that, and then the user can log in. So that's maybe an example. Maybe you guys could kind of expand a little bit more on that.
It's one of the questions that you get sometimes in an interview, right? What
Mhm.
happens? What happens when you hit submit, or what is in the back end, right? What's going on in the back end? So that's easy. I agree 100% with you, right? So that is clear that when you submit your credentials to the presentation tier, right? You do it in the front tier and the web tier, and then that is passed along to the middle tier, right? And the middle tier processes the data, getting it from the database, comparing it, and returning an okay, right? Go in. You have the green light. You're authenticated. Let's go and do it. And then after that, then we have to see if the user is authorized. So that's very important. Authentication, authorization, two different stuff, different things. Sometimes they're confused, but they're not the same, right? And then in the middle tier, you can have some sort of middlewares that you can make sure that users they have access to specific things and not to the whole thing, right? So you can prevent users from fetching some data from the database. You can prevent users from accessing the database or making changes in the database. So it's very important, right? Let's say that you, Iso, and Joel, you have only permissions to read, right? But I have permissions to read and update. And admin, we have all the permissions: create, read, update, and delete. Right? That's very important. And where that does prevention happen? In the middle tier. So that's when you
Yeah.
kind of block things, right? And prevent users from doing unauthorized actions, right?
I
So,
think we've spoken to this, but I don't think we've mentioned this security groups here. Like,
right.
does that come in play here? I know in the architecture that we see here,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it like even though it is not displayed here, but there is security groups that are implemented to make sure that the middle tier and also uh,
Right.
the presentations here are secured. So how would you say viewers that are building these 3-2 web app should be integrate or adding these security group service or just adding security groups in general to their application tier?
So if you make it a little smaller, ISO, so you have something in the VPC, right? You have something called VPC there, the virtual
Yep.
private cloud, right? So you can create firewalls in the VPC, the network part, firewalls, right? And basically, a security group is a firewall. It's a stateful firewall, right? That you can have attached to a specific server, right? When you can work on the inbound rules, because it's stateful, it means that you don't have to work on the outbound rules. You only work on the inbound rules. What is a
Yep.
stateful? Some people may wonder, what is a stateful firewall? Well, let me give you an example, and then you can talk about stateless if you want to talk about that. Let's say that I go to your house, right? And then I knock on your door, and then you say, "Okay, give me your ID," and then I let you in. Okay, I give you my ID, right? So now you know who I am, right? But when I go in, I just go to the fridge, I eat something, talk to you, talk to other people, and then when I come back, you don't remember who I am. Well, actually, you do remember who I am because you're
Yep.
stateful, right? It means that you're not gonna ask me for my ID again because you keep the track, you keep track of me, right? While I'm in the
Mhm.
house. So that's a stateful firewall. Stateless one is the opposite. You ask me for my ID, and then I go in, spend like an hour inside the house, and when I go out, you stop me because you don't know who I am, right? You forgot me, right? So you ask me for my ID again. That's why in a stateless firewall, you have to work in the inbound and outbound rules, right? But in the stateful firewall, you only work in the inbound rules. and at the level of the server, we use a stateful firewall, and that's the security group, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
that's
just
how
like
you
when you go to like
yeah
the airport, right? Like you have the TFS,
yeah
they check you out and everything, and then once you're in, you're good to go until you get out of the airport once you land, right?
it's a little
So
confusing
it's
at the airport
yeah,
because if you go to another department, they ask you for your ID again. So it's kind of a stateful and stateless at the same time. Because that
yeah,
happened to me once. I came from my country of origin, and then I am a U.S. citizen, so my wife was not, right? So I waited for her. She had to go in a bed in a room, and then she was checked there. I wasn't, but then I went in with her, and then I had to show my passport, right? Even though after I went and I checked myself and with machine, and I was okay. But I went to a different department, and then the officers there, they asked me for my passport. So it's kind of stateless
right.
and stateful, right?
You could say then yes, you probably like it's stateful during domestic flights, right? And it's stateless in international flights.
Yeah,
So when you
why
go
not?
out, when you come in, yep, they check
So
you again.
so those stateful firewalls, Joel, that's how it
And there's
works.
something else that you need to mention, Dinyeski, is about the
Hmm.
ports, right? So let's say you have those security groups placed in. You're not just going to allow any person in, right? You have to specify a particular port that some application can come in and connect to that app to that your application. For example, port 80
Yeah.
or to a database port, right? So you have to
So
put those rules in place.
so the port would be the Concorde at the airport. To go through this
Yeah,
line, and right, and it's just the
That's an
path.
interesting analogy.
Yeah, it's like the path, right? So you go to the port, a certain port has to be open. If you have a web server, port 80, 443, HTTP, HTTPS. If you're SSHing into an instance, you have to have port 22 open, or telnet 23, port 23.
yeah,
So depending on what you're doing, right? Depending on what you're doing. But security groups, the inbound rules, they are basically roles using protocols, TCP, UDP, whatever port you're opening, and then the source. Where's the traffic coming from? Right? Is it coming from another tier? Is it coming from the internet? Is it coming from where's it coming from? So you have to specify that in the inbound rules of the security group. So that's how it works. You put it in between tiers, yo, and then you make sure the communication happens based on those permissions only, right? That's it.
Absolutely.
That's it.
Absolutely. So I want to level set here a bit. I want to provide the viewers that are looking to build out again 3-2 web apps. We've talked about the presentation layer. Now we're talking about the logic layer. I want us to share some best practices as folks look to uh, get more clarity and understanding of how the logic tier should be built. I know throughout this conversation, it's been sprinkled in and out of the various points that we've made. So I wanna share my perspective of some of the best practices, but I also want to have the team chime in here. But the folks that are going to be building this, uh, we're going to share this best practice, but also we're going to show you the benefits of having to build a logic tier in a 3-2 web app. And the reason why we're doing this is to be able to, and just the overall 3-2 web app is to be able to say, hey, I'm able to interact with many services as I build these 3-2 web app applications, right? Because that's the ultimate goal of having something that is fairly easy and straightforward, like a 3-2 web app, is to be able to interact with multiple services. So I'm going to start and I'll pass it on to my teammates here to share their thoughts on best practices. So I think as you look to build a logic tier. Always, always, always. This is something that we see in the architecture here, right? And I'm going to quickly pull it up here. Is to implement, I think for me, is to have the configuration of you might guess it, auto scaling groups, right? I think I've spoken to this a couple of times. Have auto scaling configuration set, and this would help you auto scale uh, between peak loads and sudden traffic spikes. You can scale depending on the various metrics that are in that logic tier. So if you're utilizing servers, you might look into the CPU utilization. You might look into the memory usage, or you might look into other metrics that are important to you, then you fine tune that scaling policy to meet those goals. Additional thing that I would say is best practice to watch out for as you build this logic tier, and I think we've spoken to this countless of times, is the security aspect of this, right? We want you to build this logic tier to be protected as much as possible, and this is either between adding security groups, but also incorporating the or putting the logic tier behind a private subnets. I think you don't want to have this without any security groups, but also not being able to put this behind a private subnet. And if you put it in a public subnet, that's something that brings in a whole lot of issues here. But that's just a few things that I want to bring up in terms of best practice. There's more than that, but I think we can cover that actually more once we actually demo this. We want to demo this sometime to you guys when we are walking through how to build this. So I just wanted to bring that up too as well, just for the folks that are listening in and just us talking about the theory of this. I just wanted to make sure that this is covered too as well. But yeah, is there anything that the team wants to add here about what I've spoken, or
I guess maybe just superficially at a high level, one of the important things you got to do as like a system architect, software architect, is you always have to place those servers into different data centers, different availability zones. So that's very important. And we can discuss that more maybe through a demo. I
think,
don't know if you guys
yep,
are
yeah,
interested
absolutely.
in that,
So
but yeah.
yeah, so what we're gonna do next is, again, we've been mostly talking about the theory of this. We're going to finalize that theory with the database layer next week, and possibly also do that demo in that architecture too as well, or in that conversation with a database. So we're gonna do database, then follow that up with a demo of the full picture of a 3-2 web app. Uh, I just wanted to make sure that the team here or the viewers that are watching knows that we are going to be doing a demo to illustrate all the theory that we have discussed in the past couple of episodes that we've had here. So with that being said, uh, I want to always at the end of this meeting make sure that we are all on the same page. We are currently, I believe, at 85 viewers. Correct me if I'm wrong, Danielski, on our LinkedIn page. If you're watching this after, please, please, please do follow us on our LinkedIn page. We're looking to hit the 150 mark to officially be able to live stream on our LinkedIn page. If you are on our YouTube page and you're watching this, please go ahead and go to our LinkedIn page and follow that LinkedIn page. Again, we're looking to hit that 150 mark to officially go live on our LinkedIn page here. We're so close, but yet you are so far. With that being said, I'm going to throw this banner out here. Please always feel free to go like and subscribe on our YouTube channel too as well. It's the Tech Show on YouTube and the Tech Show on our LinkedIn page. Go like, comment, turn on that notification button, and do all that jazz. With that being said, any final remarks before we close out for today's episode? I think we covered the theory of the logic tier and the overall architecture of what that looks like. Any final remarks before we close out? And any questions that the audience have, please feel free to add it really quickly. But
Yeah, I
are we
wanted to
get
say that we are 724 subscribers on YouTube. So we are praying for more. So you guys can be notified of the different episodes that we're going through and all the things that we're discussing. So you guys can understand this and be able to apply them in your job or at home or different projects that you guys are doing. So we're gonna do more fun stuff in the coming sessions. So stay tuned and be excited because we are bringing good stuff. Good stuff
yeah,
as
we,
always.
we have we have so much things planned that we are looking forward to delivering, and we're itching to deliver it. I think it just we are stranded with 45 minutes of time every time, 45 to 50 minutes. So we try to set it and place it in various different episodes. But with that being said, thank you all for joining the Tech Show, episode 5, the logic tier, specifically in 3-tier web apps. We appreciate you for listening in. We will see you in a week.